All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Luke Baumgartner. I'm a research fellow here at the program on extremism at the George Washington University. Today, I am joined by an esteemed panelist of guests that includes Devin Burghardt, Leah Satilli, and Courtney Neubauer. So today, we are going to be discussing the primary topic, which is domestic violent extremism in the Pacific Northwest. And I've invited my guests here today, all because of their expertise and their firsthand on-the-ground experience with this sort of phenomenon. And I just wanted to get their expertise in on this topic so that we can provide you, the audience, with the best possible information. So if my panelists would like to introduce themselves, go right ahead.
You're on mute, Devin.
Yeah,
Hey, everybody, I'm Devin Burkhardt. I'm the executive director at the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights.
Hi there. My name is Courtney Neubauer. I'm a researcher with the Western State Center, and have done independent research work for around like 5-ish years.
I'm Leah Satilli. I am a freelance journalist in the Northwest, covering extremism, policing, class, and power for publications like High Country News. And I've done several podcasts on the topic.
great. All right. So um, I wanted to begin today's event by providing the audience with a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. So I'm sure as many of us are aware, the Pacific Northwest of the United States has a bit of a reputation as a progressive region. However, that reputation has not always held throughout history. So as we've seen over the decades, the region has been home to white supremacists, Christian nationalists, and other domestic violent extremists and hate groups that have called the area home. So today we're going to dive into some of the history of the region and attempt to answer some questions about why the Pacific Northwest has been such a magnet for some of these groups and individuals and movements. So I wanted to kind of preface this by stating that 2 days ago, December 8th, was the 40th anniversary of the death of Robert J. Matthews. Robert Matthews was a member of the Order, which is a white supremacist terrorist organization that we'll dive into a little bit in more depth later in our program. But with that being said, some of the groups and the movements that I've been sort of keeping tabs on have, made it a point to eulogize Matthews. And so that's just kind of demonstrative of the fact that his legacy and his name live on even 40 years later. So with that, I will dive into the questions for our panelists. So I'm going to start off with something potentially controversial for natives of the Northwest. What exactly is the Northwest? What states constitute the Northwest? Typically, when I think of it, I think of, usually exclusively Washington and Oregon. I've seen other people loop Northern California, parts of Idaho in there. So to you folks, what exactly is the region and how do we kind of geographically define it?
I'll jump in. So I think that the Northwest, yeah, is Washington, Oregon. I do consider Idaho a part of the Northwest. I think that generally people do. Um, I'm a part of the staff of High Country News. We covered the 11 Western states. And for a while, we had a geographical North desk, and that covered also the Northern Mountain West states. So sometimes you'll even see Montana or even Western Montana included. I'd be curious, though, what the other panelists think is the region.
I think sometimes it depends on who you ask, and sometimes people are reluctantly part of the greater Pacific Northwest and the reputation they're in. But yeah, I think that at times we've also gone like all the way over to Wyoming and included Colorado at times as well. And so I think it's just sort of a matter of like what your aim is in your definition for how you're defining it.
Yeah, I would just look back on, the kind of anti-bigotry work that's gone on in the Northwest, and it's been a bone of contention for a number of years. That groups like the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment, which later became the Northwest Coalition for Human Dignity, started by focusing on Washington, Idaho, and Oregon, and Montana. They later added Colorado and Wyoming, but the addition of those latter two were certainly amongst the board and the organization a bit controversial. But as the movement grew and extended its tentacles around the region, to a larger extent, the movement countering it had to grow and expand as well. And so I think that's part of what you have to keep in mind is, those were different times back in the 90s and 2000s compared to what they are today. So really, it's all about, focusing on what is kind of unique and quintessentially Northwest, I think is ephemeral and, difficult to define.
So do all of you have obviously you have ties to the region, but are you guys from there? Have you kind of moved, transplanted? How do you kind of what's your connection to the region?
Thanks. I can start this one off. So I am lucky in that like I have family in literally every state that we've talked about. And so my connection to the region is both like deep from like the familial perspective, and the fact that like a lot of the extremism we see has impacted my family directly. So I have a very personal stake in what's going on. And then also just lucky to also be doing this work in sort of a rural area that has like been impacted by many of the things that we're going to be talking about today. And so also what we see and talk about are things that I have seen like happen in my day-to-day life, from like re creeper recruiters at a coffee shop to like large scale demonstrations and activities as well. But also that doesn't define rural areas, shouting out that.
Yeah, I grew up in Oregon and have lived, my life since I was 8 years old in the region. So yeah, grew up in Oregon. I started as a reporter in Eastern Washington, in Cheney, Washington, if anybody knows where that is. Was a longtime reporter in Spokane. I worked for a newspaper that covered our region was from Moses Lake, which is in kind of central-ish Washington, to the Canadian border, the North Idaho Panhandle, and into western Montana, and down to Moscow, Idaho. So we had a really big region that we covered. I have worked as a reporter in Montana and done a lot in southern Idaho as well. So my work has really taken me around the region. I tend to specialize in doing rural reporting. I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings. I think that Courtney was suggesting too of the rural Pacific Northwest, that it's, just all militias and that's it. Like it's very much not that. So I like to try and bring that subtlety into my work. But yeah, the West is my home, and I get very uncomfortable when I'm in places where I can't see mountains and a lot of sky.
Yeah, for me, I'm a Northwesterner as well, with the exception of a decade out in Chicago. I grew up in Spokane during a period where the Aryan Nations was probably at their height. My first experience with the Aryan Nations was in 1983 when Robert Matthews and Richard Butler held a protest in Riverfront Park in downtown Spokane. And since then, my life has intersected many times with groups like the Aryan Nations. I was fortunate enough to be doing this work in the early 1990s. I have, experienced the Aryan Nations both going undercover to the Aryan Nations compound, being outside the Aryan Nations compound, taking down license plate numbers and paying attention to the kind of activity that the group was involved in, to working with community groups who I think are really an important, often lost side of this conversation, who were standing against the kind of hatred and bigotry being promoted by groups like the Aryan Nations as they came in and tried to make a stamp on the region.
Yeah, we'll definitely touch on your experience with the Aryan nations in a few minutes. But I want to direct another question for Leah. So you grew up in Oregon, and I think that a little known fact about Oregon that it was originally founded as an all-white territory or an all-white state, where African Americans were not allowed to settle. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit more and tell us about, Oregon's original constitution and kind of how it set the stage for our discussion today?
Yeah, definitely. So as many people know, Oregon is one of the newest states into the United States, a product of settler colonialism. And the state, the state constitution, when it was first admitted to the United States, included a actually very unique clause that said that people who are Black and people of mixed race could not live in the state. They could not stay overnight in the state. And this stayed on the books for quite some time. Pretty famously, we had something called lash laws here, where if someone stayed in the state overnight, they could be beaten. Things that I don't know how much record there is of some of these things actually being used and implement those lash laws being implemented. But this is just to say that it was, a place that welcomed racism. That was what was at the foundation of Oregon. And even when those laws were removed from the books and the state constitution was changed, certainly didn't change the mentality of a lot of people who lived here. And I think that's really evidenced through the numerous secession movements that have kind of happened over the state's history, starting with the state of Jackson and then later the state of Jefferson, notable slave owner names, suggesting maybe some of the intent of some of the people who wanted these movements to break away from Oregon and have their own state where things like having a slave would be okay. So Oregon, I think, is really unique in that regard in the Northwest, that we had this from the beginning. And throughout time, I think there are ways that it remains. Until the 1990s in Oregon, there were actual parts of the suburban Portland area where um, what do you call them, home deeds, like you could say that people of color could not live in certain neighborhoods, including the suburb where I grew up. So I think that's talks I think talking about that is important in understanding extremism in the Northwest, because like I said before, I think a lot of the people think beyond here that the extremism of the Northwest solely relies in the rural areas. And certainly some of the most prominent groups we're going to talk about originated in those areas. But why this stuff stays alive, I think, is because there's a tacit acceptance of it in suburban areas, in urban areas. So it's really an entire Northwest problem. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more. But yeah, that's some of Oregon's roots.
Yeah. On a similar note, Devin, are you aware of anything, that's similar to what Leah mentioned in Washington State?
Not at a constitutional level, but certainly amongst, we had a number of sundown towns across the state, as well as, there are a number of states or a number of communities that have those restrictive covenants, including right here in the Seattle area, that exclude home ownership by African American and other people of color. So yeah, it's certainly, not a unique problem, but at the kind of state constitutional level, like it was in Oregon, that was certainly a different thing.
Yeah.
As a fellow Oregonian too, I think that one of the things that I find interesting is there's the Oregon Donation Land Act, which specifically like tried to encourage people to come out west. And there are people in my town that can directly tie their lineage to that act and to sort of the promises of the United States government that like they would have access to resources for, as long as time could tell. And one of the things we see out here as well is the indigenous folks getting their rights really trampled on. And so the United States sort of worked in coalition to create this like idea that the West was this untouched place. And we see that a lot sometimes in the environmentalist space as well, that the West is something to leave untouched rather than acknowledging indigenous stewardship of the land. And I think that one thing important to remember as well is throughout sort of the period of tribes like both getting sent to reservations, later terminated, is that Oregon was also one of the last places where there was an armed conflict between the United States government and a tribal nation, and that was the Modocs. And Modoc people were kept as illegal prisoners of war in Oklahoma. And so while there's the Klamath tribes now, there's also a separate tribe in Oklahoma of Modoc people who are descendants from sort of that illegal prisoners of war situation. And as like a lot of tribes lost sort of some of their greatest like resources during the termination period, those fights continued on. And in 2001, the Chinook Indian Nation just received their federal recognition. So in Oregon, a lot of the tribes lost their status around the 1950s and regained them in the 1980s. But I think when we think about the West, we also need to think about the indigenous folks who are first stewards of the land and whose rights are and treaty obligations of the United States are very much still active and still not fulfilled. And I think that that also really impacts the West as a state. And for folks who are also interested more in Black history of Oregon, Walida Imarisha is like an incredible writer, researcher, speaker. So go type her name into Google and listen to some of her talks if you're interested in more of that Black history of Oregon.
Yeah, I think that I think the concept of, manifest destiny and westward expansion is a bit lost on us. It's 2024, almost 2025, and we think of this concept of, it is our destiny to settle the rest of these lands. I think that's separated enough, far enough in time for a lot of us to kind of forget that and forget that it's kind of set the stage for a lot of, the topics that we're going to cover later in this discussion. So I appreciate everybody's comments on that. Now, I think with that sort of history in mind and what Leah, Devin, and Courtney have all kind of mentioned about these sort of secessionist movements, that's something else that I want to talk about. It's sort of a topic that goes by a few different names. Like we said, State of Jefferson, Northwest Territorial Imperative, American Redoubt. I've heard Greater Idaho. These are all sort of names that this secessionist idea goes by. So what exactly are these movements and where did they come from? And do they still hold some water today? Are they still popular with some folks? Is the movement still alive and well?
Yes, very much so. Sorry, Devin.
No,
Maybe I
go
can
ahead.
lay a little bit of the ground floor because I'm sure you have lots to say about the Northwest Territorial Imperative. I think that um, part of where historically the secessionist movements in the Northwest happen is that, these are very large states. Anytime I write for an East Coast outlet, I've had to come up against people saying, we need you to get you to this place to do a story right now. And I'll say, it's going to take me 5 hours to get there. I think sometimes folks forget that the geography of these states is massive. So I say that because in these massive land areas, you have population centers like Seattle, Portland, Boise. These are places that have big control over, specifically Seattle and Portland have a lot of control over state politics. So what happens in Portland, the way voters will vote will tend to sway state politics statewide. So I just offer this because I think historically people who don't live in those city centers tend to feel aggrieved that every time they cast a vote, they never quite get their way. They feel that Portland and Seattle are progressive havens, and a place like Harney County, Oregon, or Pend Oreille County, Washington. These are places that culturally just really different, and so drives a lot of the secessionist ideas. I think sometimes extremists will have these ideas, but sort of more quote unquote normal folks will get on board because they're like, yeah, it is culturally really different. I don't want to live in Seattle. So I just lay that as a groundwork, but maybe talking about the Northwest Territorial imperative would be a good place to start.
No, that's great. For the Northwest Territorial Imperative, there have been many different versions of it, but it was originally an idea concocted by Bob Miles, a Nazi leader, and Richard Butler of the Aryan nations. It was, and many of these different formulations are kind of a retreat style, enclave style nationalism that no longer were white supremacists going to be able to control the entire United States, but that individuals supportive of those ideas needed to retreat to different areas or enclaves. You know, in the 1970s, before then, it was the idea to retreat to the South and kind of, restore Southern nationalism. Butler and the others came up with the idea of a whites only Northwest Territorial Imperative to have whites move to the Pacific Northwest and establish it as a white homeland, primarily because of um, the dominance of the white population out here and some of the historical notions that we've mentioned. So it was an effort to build up a kind of a redoubt, if you will, a kind of a local base of support from which to then conquer the United States and eventually the world. We've seen this more recently take other forms, whether that be the kind of, smaller scale kind of county or state secessionism, or the kind of efforts to try to build pioneer little Europes, or essentially taking over small rural communities to take over a region, one community at a time. But the idea is part of a larger political program to promote white supremacy, white nationalism, by starting at a smaller spot and then using that as a place from which to build outwards.
Yeah, and
Yeah, with one of the more contemporary examples that we could probably point to, if anybody has ever seen the documentary Welcome to Leith, it's about, this, I think it was a creativity movement person, follower of Ben Klassen, that basically tried to buy out, him and his, Nazi buddies tried to buy out this entire small town called Leith in South Dakota. And the citizens of that town fought back very bravely, drove him out. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. I believe it's on Amazon Prime and a couple other places. But I think that's a contemporary example that we can point to that's a little more recent in time. Courtney, what were you gonna add to that?
yeah, one of sort of the other lineages that we see of that kind of movement happening is the Greater Idaho movement that's happening right now. And we see counties across a pretty large region. There's a little bit of a misunderstanding. There's like, if you listen to Greater Idaho, they've committed to being part of Greater Idaho. They are Greater Idaho. But when you actually look at the language, it's much more nuanced. A lot of times it's like they'll create a committee to investigate. And I think that one of the things when thinking about sort of the larger scale and political attempts right now to sort of create and carve out those parts of the state is to remember that just like in Leaf, like when it actually comes to one's town, there is really great pushback. But they're going and putting them on generally like off-year elections with low voter turnout and fewer people who understand like what the exact like language is asking for, because they're often written kind of vaguely. And so I think too we have that movement happening currently that gets its roots from many of the things that Devin was talking about, and sort of tries to leverage what Leah was talking about, that feeling that people aren't being represented. And a lot of that too has to deal with like land issues, farming, and what the sort of implications of those look like, and people feeling like large cities don't understand what's happening on the ground in many of these eastern parts of both Washington and Oregon.
I'm
Yeah,
glad
I'm
we're
glad.
talking so much about Greater Idaho. Sorry to interrupt you there. I think it is very important. This is an issue that has received an sort of inordinate amount of national media attention, including, the Atlantic doing a story that said this is the most successful secessionist movement in the country. It's frankly misinformation because, like Courtney says, these ballot measures that have passed in these communities are just to form a committee to talk about moving to Idaho, not actually we're moving to Idaho. So is that successful? I mean, by local standards, I would say no. I think the other thing about these, specifically Greater Idaho, is that a lot of times these movements historically will be framed like rural land issues and things like that. But, when I reported on the Greater Idaho movement, the leaders of the movement were very clear that this had to do with abortion, it had to do with marijuana, it had to do with a lot of these things that are seen as progressive issues. It had to do with trans kids, things like that. So these are the things that I think oftentimes get lost because the settler colonial mentality and the myth of the West is so contagious, and shows like Yellowstone, nationwide, internationally a hit. That perpetuates this idea that these are just cowboys out here and they just want to be left alone and live conservatively on their free land. And um, a lot of times in that mythology, people forget to ask the questions about why these secessionist movements are happening. And if they do, very clearly they'll hear it's just because they don't like trans kids and abortion.
Yeah, I got my mailer from Greater Idaho a while ago, and the mail, and I, snapped all my pictures, and there was a line, here's what Idaho represents. While it did have land issues and taxes, it absolutely included woke mind virus things
Immigration.
immigration. And it's really interesting to see states as far as like Montana talking about the southern border, and we had like Idaho sending troops to the southern, or police to the southern border. And so I think it's those sort of top line issues that definitely are getting pulled into the secessionist movement conversation.
Yeah, those are all, excellent points, and I think especially prescient. So next, this is mainly for Devin or anybody else who wants to chime in on this, but as Devin and I sort of brainstormed a couple topics for this event, he mentioned, and previously in our event, that he mentioned that he had some firsthand experience with the Aryan nations, Richard Butler, and all their associated fellows. So how would you describe your experience with them, like your first contact and kind of how it progressed throughout the rest of the Aryan nation's sort of existence? Ties with, the Order or Harold Covington or any other of these, prominent figures within the movement.
Well, I think it's important to remember that for a number of years, the Aryan nations defined the problem of white supremacy in the Northwest to the larger public. It became an international stain on the region and became synonymous with Idaho. And, in fact, they spent millions of tourism dollars trying to fight against that reputation, even long after the Aryan nations was gone. For me, my experience began, as I mentioned earlier, in '83 when Robert Matthews came to town. After that, I experienced it on a regular basis where white power skinheads who had been brought into the Aryan nations were coming over to Spokane regularly to try to either beat up or recruit my friends. So even, while I was in high school, I had that experience. And in that period, it was also a time where the Aryan nations began its most violent period, where you had them doing things like committing a series of bombings against civil rights activists in northern Idaho, including the bombing of a longtime friend and mentor of mine, uh, Bill Wasmith, who went on to lead the Kootenai County Task Force and then the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. They robbed banks and armored cars. They talked about counterfeiting money at the Aryan nations. They killed a Jewish talk show host in Denver and a Missouri state trooper, and really captured the national attention in terms of their focus and activity. And in so doing, became a center of attention for the rest of the movement, to which the Aryan Nations annual Congress that held there in Hayden Lake, just outside Hayden Lake on their 20-acre compound, became a national gathering for white supremacists around the globe to come to mingle and participate and build out a larger movement. It's important to understand that in this period, this is long before the internet, right? That folks who found their way into this movement had to do so either primarily through individual contact or through luck by seeing, a flyer at a Grange Hall, or by picking up a copy of the Spotlight at a local diner, or by, having some sort of incidental contact, or maybe stumbling onto a public access show by Tom Metzger in their local community. The availability and the for people to step on the radicalization conveyor belt for white supremacy was way different than it is today. Back then, when I was still in high school, a friend and I, one of the first things we did when we got a new computer, an Apple II, way back in the day, was, we learned how to hack into the Aryan Nations bulletin board system, the Liberty Net, which was created by Louis Beam, the guy who came up with the notion of leaderless resistance and the kind of, lone wolf racist terror ideas, and creating cells to build out the structure for carrying out racist terror. They also were really early on in creating a communication system which tied together individuals from around the country through computer bulletin board systems, and helped to begin that process of networking and building out a movement, which then we saw for another decade dominate the discussion about this stuff. And it's also important to remember that at that same time, the movement also provided a base in terms of that networking for things we would see later on down the road. It was at some of those congresses and at those, Christian identity Bible studies at the Aryan Nations Congress, where people like John Trockman of the Militia Montana came into the movement and came into the picture. It was where you saw folks like, a connection to other identity pastors, folks like Pete Peters in Colorado, who would go on to hold that Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, which is many, have established as the kind of origin point of the modern militia movement in the 1990s. It was, the connection for me personally to other identity pastors. I would later find out that Carl Schott, a Christian identity pastor, had this cute little white, Christian identity church just down the block from my grandma's house. So, having grown up in that environment and having, seen the kind of impact that it has on individuals as well as dominating the political conversation, it was really important to have that understanding. And, if you're really interested in looking at kind of a deep, thorough understanding of this, there are a number of books I'd recommend. Most highly, I'd recommend IREHR founder Lenny Zeskin's book, Blood and Politics, A History of the White Nationalist Movement from the Margins to the Mainstream. It goes into really important detail about this period, and the kind of things that followed. Because remember that also during this period, it was a time when you had things like, the Posse Comitatus in the Midwest doing their thing during the farm crisis, and the relationship between AN and the Posse are, something that, both folks like Lenny and Danny Levitas in his book, The Terrorist Next Door, have talked about. So yeah, that kind of larger movement is also something to consider. While things were a bit more isolated back in the 80s in the Northwest, there were these attempts to build out these national movements. And in no small part, the effort of the order was a way to try to finance and build out that larger attempt to create a vanguardist wing of the white supremacist movement and kick off the race war.
Yeah, because the order, they pulled off the largest armored vehicle heist in U.S. history to date. I still think that
Yep.
record still stands. It was like $3 million or something like that, which is, however many times greater today in its worth. And that while there's no like certain definitive evidence of where that money went, at least some of the estimates that I've seen is that they went to William Luther Pierce from the National Alliance. They went to, other neo-Nazi organizations. Some even say, CSA, Covenant Sword, Arm of the Lord, down in Elohim City has been another target. And none of that money was ever recovered. To this date, 40 years later, nobody's ever been able to kind of trace that money down. So I think that speaks volumes to the level of commitment that some of these movements, organizations, and individuals displayed to kind of making this a thing.
Well, I think it also
Um,
speaks to the resonance to which that the violent end of the movement has had. It was the words of order member David Lane, with the 14 words, it still resonates as with amongst accelerationists today. The that kind of commitment, dedication, and impact still have long lasting reverberation inside that wing of the movement.
yeah. So with that, I think that's a great segue to the way that sort of Aryan nations, Richard Butler, and that sort of milieu kind of tied into Ruby Ridge, in which no discussion about the Pacific Northwest is kind of complete without mentioning. Leah, I know this is one of your favorite topics. You mentioned. So for the panel and for our guests, what happened at Ruby Ridge? Like 30,000 foot overview. What happened there? And how did that kind of spur a lot of the other incidents in the 1990s?
Yeah, and I'm happy to take the lead on this conversation because I do love this, but I would love to hear from the other panelists too, because when this happened, frankly, I was 11 years old. So I wasn't there on the ground, watching it happen. But there was an individual named Randy Weaver who would like to attend the Aryan Nations and had moved from Ohio, I believe, with his wife to a mountaintop in, very rugged area of North Idaho. They were survivalists. They wanted to have their, cabin that they built with their own hands and practice their kind of Christian identity adjacent religion that Vicky Weaver, Randy's wife, was really uh, fervent about, I guess I would say. So they moved there to kind of practice their religion, live off the land. Randy started making pals around the Aryan nations. Heard some ideas there that he really liked, and because the Aryan nations was crawling with FBI informants and law enforcement undercover, he ended up uh, selling a sawed-off shotgun to an informant. And was this an FBI informant, Devin? Do you remember this correctly? Yeah. So
Actually, an ATF.
ATF, that's right. Yeah. So he sold a sawed-off shotgun, sawed off by, I think, so it was illegally sawed off by like a quarter of an inch. Like it wasn't by a lot. But the fact was that it was a legal gun. And when he faced charges for that, he refused to show up in court. So after enough times that he refused to show up in court, the feds started coming for him. And he wouldn't leave his mountaintop cabin to come into court to face the charges that he was supposed to be facing, and this led to a prolonged standoff on this mountain that the forces of the U.S. government all came there because of this sawed-off shotgun, and tragically during this time a lot of bullets were traded and his teenage son and his wife were killed during the standoff. So Vicky Weaver and Sam Weaver were both killed. There was a U.S. Marshal that was also killed, and so there was blood traded on both sides. But I think in terms of why Ruby Ridge is so important, this is one of those instances like Waco where the federal government came in hot, extremely hot, and learned a lot of really hard lessons, but that also created martyrs for the movement. So even today, you will see, flags, you will hear the name Vicky and Sam Weaver talked about as if these were martyrs of people who simply just wanted to live differently and were killed by the government for wanting to live that way. It's not exactly true. That was the only reason that they were killed. There were crimes that were not seen in court, but at the end of the day, people died. So that's the very quick and dirty Ruby Ridge. I'm sure I missed things.
I just add, I think the other important element of it is it also became a spectacle. So it drew a lot of far right activists from around the region to around the site. It became one of those early meeting points where people who may not have had contact before began to develop connections and began to network and really laying the groundwork for what would become the militia movement in the coming years. Came out of those, a lot of those early connections formed out of that. It's a lot like we see in other standoffs, at least, done amazing podcasts on, like the Bundy standoffs in both Bunkerville and the Malheur Wildlife Reserve, right? They create opportunities for myth making as well as for development of networks and ties and kind of forging bonds amongst individual in the midst of these conflicts. In this case, it was people standing outside at the gates, getting to know one another and acting as, foils for local media to talk to get quotes from and begin developing those contacts. But it really did, in a lot of respects, both myth making wise as well as kind of individual movement connection wise, build those bonds which would lead to the militia movement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I,
Go ahead,
um,
Courtney.
oh, thanks. Sorry. I was just reading earlier the amount of militia leaders that either if they were there or not say they were, they're like, one of them is the founder of the Oregon 3% movement. And he swears up and down he was right outside those gates and went with other people who also were aligned with the militia. Yeah, and then just talking standoffs, I think there's also lower level moments in communities, often before a very large standoff. And I'm thinking in particular, there's something called the Sugar Pine Mine in Southern Oregon. And it's often referred to now as like just a labor conflict. It was these poor miners down on their luck, and we've seen this across a lot of issues, right? These poor individuals who are subject to federal government overreach. That's the line that they stick to, and we also saw that in Ruby Ridge as well. But actually, it was a gathering of CSPOA, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, along with a series of oath keepers who were doing sort of that ground laying work. And I think what it also sort of fomented was this protection mindset, this protection language. People in the militia movements were going because they wanted to protect these people. They wanted to protect the women and protect the children. And that's sort of the line that they went into. And like Devin alluded to, shortly after the Sugar Pine Mine came the Malheur Wildlife Refuge occupation. And similar to how you hear the names involved in the the other conflicts, Lavoy Finicum has become a name who reverberates across the West. And just this last year, they held a sort of memorial for the incident where he was shot. And Lavoy Finicum was a far-right leader involved in the occupation who was stopped while he was outside of sort of the main space of occupation. And his memorial is attended by Threepers, by Patriot Front, and people who sort of represent a large group, but those martyrdoms also lead to moments of intense like community building as well, the memorials after. And I just wanted to, like Leah has been saying a lot about like rural communities not being just these hotbeds of extremism. Also just wanted to shout out that during the Malheur Wildlife occupation, there was also incredible community groups who were trying to push back. There was one in particular that I really love because Bundy had said like if everyone wants me gone, I'll leave. And they had a community meeting and they're like, raise your hand if you want Bundy to leave. And everyone was like, we do want him here. And I think a lot of times when you're thinking about the large scale interactions and conflicts with the federal government and occupations, one of the things that gets lost is the impact locally. People in Malheur, I know, are still sort of experiencing the reverberations of that effect and fracture within their community, and that a lot of people travel. And more that's happening. But they're not, it wasn't, just people in Malheur who were occupying, but it was people who are traveling because they're part of this larger movement to try to push white ethno-state ideals and Christian nationalism.
Yeah, Courtney, when all those sort of events kind of happened, I kind of want to pull on that urban-rural divide just a little bit more. Um, so how what sort of interplay between the urban and rural sort of areas did you kind of see during these events? Like, were people from, these traditionally progressive areas around, Portland or Seattle or, Bend or any of these other places kind of find their way into these, standoffs, events, or what did you notice?
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I think that when you are looking at these occupations, oftentimes it's an intense, like Devin said, I think, spectacle. And so spaces that are not meant to hold that amount of people from just like hotel room perspective alone, get flooded with people who don't necessarily have the context to report on the situation in a way that's really mindful of the community being impacted. And one of the terms I like to use is like a strategically underfunded. And I think that when you're looking at some of these role places, one of the things people don't necessarily understand is that oftentimes some of these leaders are very well resourced and very well funded, and that they don't represent the experience on the ground. I know across the eastern part of the Pacific Northwest, largely, there's also issues of poverty. A lot of the poorest sort of areas in the states are in these parts that don't have the infrastructure and don't have the resources to necessarily push back. And one of the things that I'm always trying to sort of address is this idea that extremism only exists in rural places. And we saw people like traveling from Portland to support the occupation. We saw people traveling from Seattle and other large areas supporting these occupiers. And I think that part of that interlay and that struggle between the urban and the rural is an act also goes back to the tribes, because what you saw in Malheur as well is that there was like destruction of indigenous artifacts, and there's often attempts by the far right to weave connections within tribal nations. And I think that that is something that sort of like loses its nuance in national conversations, but a lot of the times the requests, the reason people think that they're allowed to do these standoffs go back to what we talked about earlier about manifest destiny and about people thinking that they have the unalienable right to occupy this land and access the resources they did. And with the Malheur occupation, it started with a court case around fires on federal land, and they're like, you have to pay for what you're doing, submit a permit, and touches into that sovereign citizen movement that again like finds its underpinnings in Christian nationalism and indirect attack to indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, it's kind of it can be kind of confusing a little bit when you kind of look at all the ways in which these movements and ideologies are sort of interconnected. I know we brought up, sort of this posse comitatus and constitutional sheriff sort of flavor. We have sovereign citizens and we have militias and we have the neo-Nazis. It can be a little overwhelming for somebody who's kind of, looking at this and trying to parse out, okay, where are these individuals coming from? Like, what exactly is what's their deal? What's their shtick? And I think it can kind of muddy the waters when we're trying to look at this from either a research perspective or a policy perspective and trying to come up with, some solutions either at the community or the state or the national level for bring some of these, groups and harmful ideologies and individuals that, quite frankly, pose a danger to these communities and disrupt them. So with that, I kind of want to move into the modern day and looking at the modern threat landscape that presents itself in the Northwest. I think since around the 2016-17 era, especially after the death of George Floyd in 2020, we saw a big sort of resurgence in activity from groups like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and a lot of these Patriot Front and a lot of these other groups that we, for the, normal casual observer, you wouldn't necessarily associate with these areas of the country. So with that, like, what does it look like now? We have active clubs, we have, some of these other groups and individuals popping up. Um, so how does that kind of shape our understanding of what we're seeing today?
I guess I can go first. I would start by saying that, you have a continued fulfilling of the base of support amongst those who are kind of at the vanguardist wing of the movement, the kind of, everyone from the accelerationists to the active club types, those who believe in kind of explicit white nationalism. Those folks still have a role and are still having, gaining some ground in the last year or two, particularly as some of the other movements we've seen took a bit of a nosedive post insurrection. But the other thing I think that's amongst the more important trends in the Pacific Northwest is how many of the ideas that we long saw promoted by the more extreme end of the movement have moved so significantly from the margins to the mainstream. So to see, for instance, in Washington State, the head of the state GOP, for instance, we profiled Jim Walsh in our 22 report, Breaching the Mainstream, as the individual had joined the most far-right Facebook groups that we tracked. In fact, he joined, I think, 24 different ones, including militia and other far-right organizations. And, both was then inundated with, far-right propaganda, as well as being a pipeline to these various different far-right organizations and giving them the imprimatur of those, or, of his stature in terms of his role within, being a legislator and his role within the GOP. If you look to Idaho, for instance, Dorothy Moon, the head of the Idaho GOP, was also a member of Ammon Bundy's People's Rights Network, one of the largest networks of an umbrella organization that brought together far right organizations of various different stripes, everyone from Proud Boys and Three Percenters to anti-vaxxers and sovereign citizens, all under one umbrella, primarily to fight the pandemic. That's an organization that's undergone a lot of tumult since Ammon Bundy lost a $53.5 million judgment in a defamation case brought by St. Luke's. Full disclosure, I served as an expert witness on that case and, also served as a consultant on it. But, as a result of that, you saw his organization, which was growing at a rate of around 1,200 online members a month prior to that trial, go to a membership now of gaining only about 17 new members a month. So tremendous change in terms of how the organization is impacted. It's also a reminder of the kind of external forces that can play on movements as well, be that lawsuits or community pushback or a variety of different other options that these things don't exist in a vacuum. And when you think of groups like the Aryan Nations, that's also an important part of that story. In 2000, Southern Poverty Law Center essentially sued the Aryan nations out of existence in the Pacific Northwest and changed that character. Did that mean that the problems underlying it and that led to some of the support regionally went away? No, it meant it changed. Heraclitus once said you can't step twice in the same stream, and white supremacy and white nationalism adapt continually to their surroundings, both from pushback from society at large to other changing countercurrents. And they try to take advantage of them as well. So part of our jobs as researchers is always to try to keep an eye on where those streams are headed and to see those new trends coming up so we can alert communities to what they're going to face, both in the short and the long term. But I'm talking too much, please.
Yeah, I just to kind of add on to some things that Devin said, I love that you brought up Jim Walsh. I was just driving up Interstate 5 last week, which is, goes from British Columbia to the Mexican border here in the West. And there's this notorious conspiracy theory billboard that's been up since the 70s near Centralia, Washington. And it's got a picture of Uncle Sam, and it's always spouting something insane. And the name, the conspiracy theory on the billboard hasn't changed in a few years for a variety of reasons I won't get into. But right in front of the billboard is a Jim Walsh sign, almost like an endorsement of it. And I think that is, a great metaphor when we're looking for metaphors here of the GOP in the West, is that these groups were always seen as very fringe, like we don't want to be a part of that, that's not us. But slowly we've seen particularly I'm thinking in Oregon, of an embrace and not quite pushing away and saying that's not who we are. And the reason why was because these states out here are so progressive that, to get anything done as a Republican, you've got to kind of be able to work with your Democratic colleagues. But now more and more we've seen less of that because of this embrace of the fringe. In Oregon, we have had several walkouts by the Republican representatives here from the state house, where they refuse to participate in the proceedings. And I think that shows, that's a really extreme tactic to take. It also gets nothing done for your constituents, but that's kind of a part of the way things are going here. When we talk about Idaho too, I think I'm glad Dorothy Moon was brought up, but I think Heather Scott is another person that's really important to point out. She was at the Bunkerville standoff in 2014. She came to the wildlife refuge at Malheur in 2016. She's been a pal of the Bundys and their ilk, and was a part of a group called the Coalition of Western States, which was several lawmakers that were trying to really enforce this anti-public lands agenda that was pushed by the Bundys. And she's still very much in office in North Idaho. And North Idaho, we've seen just a lot of activity and excitement around her. When Patriot Front, the notorious U-Haul full of guys in their khakis and polos, they were coming to town after Heather Scott had given speeches that seemed to be encouraging activity like that around a Pride celebration. Also, Ammon Bundy, I think that it's really important to talk about that St. Luke's case, because that seemed to be the thing that was going to take out Ammon Bundy and put him in jail. But right now he's free and living very publicly in Cedar City, Utah, and not paying these millions of dollars that he owes. And I think that's important to remember, that in the history of the West, there have been successes as far as prosecuting people, but by and large, recently, there have not. There have been a lot of people who've taken over federal properties and not been convicted by a jury, who've pointed guns at federal agents at Bunkerville, and their trials were thrown out by a judge. So there's just been kind of a real slipperiness, I think, by some of the main members of the movement that shows, now we're looking at January 6th potentially with a lot of those people could be pardoned. I think it shows that there's, every time that kind of thing happens, I think it encourages the movement. And specifically in the West, we've seen that a lot.
Yeah, it certainly did with Fort Smith in Arkansas, when the members of the order were acquitted by a jury there regarding their racist terror campaign during that period. Yeah, so it is, what that did is it emboldened them, right? It allowed them to become both status figures in the movement, martyrs, and really created the sense that people could get away with committing these acts of violence. And so we saw copycats and we saw additional attempts to do it. And we saw a movement grow as a result of the failure of that federal prosecution.
Yeah, I think talking about Bundy too, it's important to remember he got a presidential pardon um, prior to the St. Luke's case, and that he had in that St. Luke's law case, there was also it was meant in a way to sort of go after the organization of people's rights. But the People's Rights website now is just has I think they have like 7 different web addresses, all utilizing international domains to host their work. And also talking about that notorious U-Haul Patriot Front, in that while there were some legal consequences and some days in jail for the folks who were on the ground involved, they also did try to go after Russo, who's one of the organization founders, and that did not move forward, and a judge dismissed that outright. So I think that there's also those moments where there's that attempt to hold organizations accountable, hold organizational leaders accountable, and we don't see those being quite as successful quite as often, and do lead to some of that emboldened behavior. And talking about some of the groups that we see on the ground as well, one of the things that I think about is on January 6th, there was, the Washington, D.C. insurrection, but Oregon was also one of the places that had a local attack on the U.S. Capitol. And part of, using that same Stop the Steal narrative, and was a sort of gathering for many of the folks and groups that we've been talking about. But they also had a connection with Representative Mike Mearman, who some videos suggest that he let folks in through the back door. And I think that when I think about the Pacific Northwest and some of the politics, I think that there's been some really successful strategic use of a thing called the precinct strategy, which is folks get in local offices at a really low level and then slowly take more control and more power. And one of the places that's been really successful is by the People's Rights Movement, which again, Ammon Bundy created sort of post-occupation, in part to push back against some COVID policies. But they've pretty successfully taken over the Deschutes County Republican Party, as well as bought land. And they have sort of a central land base that I was super curious in the St. Luke's case if they would go after the land as being part of the movement resources. But
They're trying.
yeah, would love to see that happen. But they did it successfully by having a bunch of members put it under their direct names. And so I think you can also, there was a politician in Klamath who was a people's rights leader who was going for a more higher elected office. I think she's county commissioner. And she just got under the margin. She made it through the first round of elections, but we're seeing more folks who are part of these groups go for sort of small local offices. And you can also see this with like Brandon Durst in North Idaho, where he was the superintendent of West Bonner School District, which, like, who knows who your superintendent is off the top of your head? Not me. But he was able to sort of hire members of his circle that included folks like Dave Riley's wife, and Dave Riley is a talk show host who is connected to the 2017 Unite the Right rally. And so I think that what we see when it comes like to political issues is that someone gets in the door and then they sort of usher and help their friends get into those leadership positions. And to address that at a local level often means that the people who are trying to call out those actions do get targeted by these large networks, which is when we talk about St. Luke's, it was a hospital that took away a CPS involved case. A child ended up getting taken away, and they had an organizational response. And when we look at Ruby Ridge, when we talk about Malheur, it all goes back to that language of protection. And I think we also saw that a lot with the wildfires that happened and how militia groups set up their points of security, where they were attacking folks who they didn't think belonged as part of sort of their larger mission. And again, goes back to that language of protection, but then you have to question like protection of what and protection of who.
Yeah, those are all, excellent points. So I'm going to move into some, Q&A from our audience. So I'll take the last few minutes that we have here today and focus on some of those. So one question is, in addition to organized extremism in the Pacific Northwest, what are we seeing from the sovereign citizen movement?
Well, I can take that, I guess. Sovereign citizens saw a bit of a bump during the pandemic. They saw the pandemic as an opportunity to kind of push the bogus notion that you can renounce your citizenship and do things like that as a way to get away from the excessive government overreach of things like wearing a mask or getting vaccinated. And so you saw more people looking for responses being attracted to the sovereign citizen end of the movement, and you saw more people inside the kind of anti-vax wing of the larger far right promoting more sovereign citizen-esque ideas, right? Be that the kind of notion of the county sheriff, or the notion that you can, that you don't have to comply because you're a different kind of citizen. All of those ideas gained some additional resonance inside the movement during that period. And so you saw once again kind of a bit of a rekindling of some of those sovereign citizen flames. Sovereign citizens are a thing that's been there for decades and decades, and kind of ebbs and flows as other parts of the movement die away. People are often kind of, as they move along a radicalization conveyor belt, that's often where they end up, as a kind of one path. They find themselves finally going to the extremes of taking off their license plates, renouncing their citizenship, getting rid of their driver's licenses, which almost invariably leads to conflicts with law enforcement and, local authorities. So it is a, kind of a self-fulfilling downward spiral. As more people are exposed to it, more people end up in those kind of conflicts, which include things like shooting at law enforcement. So that's, certainly an area we're paying attention to. They're having to compete with so many different versions of these kind of approaches. So there's no one particular guru or activist that is promoting this kind of stuff. Guru, their language, not mine. But it is something that we're certainly paying attention to, as it does so often lead to conflict with local officials and with law enforcement.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I think one of the things too, when you're thinking about sovereign citizens, is oftentimes you'll find movements or groups that have their ideological foundations in sovereign citizen movement, which leads to what Devin was talking about, is when they get deeper and deeper and deeper, and start talking to the movement leaders who often have some type of connection to the previous generation's movement leaders. That's when sort of you see that more like direct, like, I'm going to attack a power substation. I'm going to try to trigger what I believe should be the outcome of the United States' like downfall, to lead to their sovereign citizen white ethno-state utopia that they're often striving towards, even if the outright movements don't say like, we are fighting for a white ethno state where we are not citizens of the United States. Sometimes when you get down to the layers and get on that conveyor belt, that's what's happening. And I think that one of the interesting things as well is across like vast spaces, like in Montana, they are still holding some of those sovereign citizen courts to condemn leaders of the United States, and hold their sort of separate courts. And because with the sovereign citizen movement, they're also creating a parallel structure that is built in sort of their image.
So in that sort of similar vein, um, what sort of groups or movements do we see becoming, a bigger concern? Because there's a couple questions here from the audience about, agave groups, which is anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremism, and some of active clubs. Like, what are some of the more contemporary organizations that others might be missing or we're not focusing on enough?
I think one group that's come up a lot in my reporting are some of these active clubs, specifically the Evergreen Active Club, which shares a lot of members with White Lives Matter in Washington. And I think the reason that they've come up in the reporting that I've done is they've really kind of launched a concerted attack on pride festivals, pride celebrations, anything having to do with that. So we've seen, I believe it was in the summer of 2023 that we were seeing lots of pride celebrations from Missoula, Montana to Oregon City to Centralia, Washington, where this active club was showing up. Centralia, which is in the center of Western Washington, I think is one place that's been really interesting to watch that why the active club showed up there. There's quite a concerted a group of Asatru people who practice Asatru, which is like a sort of whites only religion. I'm reducing it down to that definition just for brevity's sake. But I think that that's interesting that there's really these active clubs are pulling from White Lives Matter, Asatru, neo-Nazi groups to kind of say we're an active club, and then they show up in places. I think with pride celebrations, they're kind of capitalizing on the fact that there's been so much rhetoric around trans youth, trans sports, things like that. It's an issue that a lot of people are thinking and talking about because of Republican talking points. So I think active clubs are seeing that as a way that they can recruit folks into their more extreme causes. So that's just one example of a group that I've been looking at.
Yeah, I would echo that absolutely as well. And the thing that's interesting about active clubs is like they can be as little as 3 people, as large as like 15. And they're really focused on building social bonds first. And one of the things we see so often in far-right organizing is they break down because of intergroup fighting. And I think that that's sort of something the active clubs are trying to address. They're like, if we have a couple guys who like to hang out and do physical training and get beers at their local like 3 per bar, if we're able to build those bonds, they'll be able to do more active work together. And I think when you think about active clubs as well, you also have to overlay an issue of international connection. There was just a report by Southern Poverty Law Center about, I think it was a Serbia-based group who was making a lot of the merch and swag for the group. And when Russo was arrested, or wrong name, different white nationalists. When their leader was arrested, though, all of the groups were like holding sort of memorials and trying to paint him as a martyr. And with active clubs, I think the interesting thing as well is they're willing to travel internationally across state lines. And then they only have a couple gatherings a year. One of them is in California to do like physical matches against each other. So there's those bonds that are being created that also really concern me. And I think that, talking about the Pride celebrations, what I saw was White Lives Matter, Patriot Front, and active clubs, and sort of a cross identity, but having more names so they sound bigger than they are, I think is one of the tools that they use a lot. And I just also wanted to throw in that I think when these groups align, they, like Leah was talking about, are trying to do recruiting. And you also saw this a bit in Montana. There was a rally and they attacked an or protested in front of an immigration center and then went to a pro-Palestine protest and tried to pull in folks on the left to an anti-immigrant message using some of the language where they might be able to pull people in. So one of the things that I'm interested in as well is those places where far-right extremists are trying to pull in larger audience or build cross-group connections.
Courtney, on that point, and this can be for anybody on the panel, but uh, what sort of do we see any of these people trying to recruit younger and younger, individuals, like targeting youth online at, like, 11, 12, 13 years old, utilizing social media to do so? What are some of the trends that we see with that?
I think a great example of that that has a pretty big Northwest tie is the development of Telegram, and the use of Telegram as a way to recruit younger and younger people. The activists who were recently arrested in the Telegram plot, purposefully were recruiting online on social media, on Telegram specifically, of everyone that they recruited was under the age of 19. And they recruited them to do things. So far, there have been arrests like in Slovakia, the arrest of an attack, an attack there, another attack in Turkey, and the efforts to take out a power station in New Jersey are all tied to Telegram, but it's an effort that has comes out of the kind of Atomwaffen division accelerationist wing of the movement, and has been successful at recruiting a younger and younger clientele to engage in those acts of racist terror. It's a reminder that when you think about this stuff, at the Institute, we look at it as kind of a continuum. That's on the one hand, you have the kind of vanguardist types who want to start the race war, and those on the other end who, are the mainstreamers, those who are focused on seizing power using political means. And I think what both Courtney and Leah point to when they're specifically talking about the active clubs and groups like that on the white nationalist tip of things, as the mainstreamers have become so predominant, right? The idea of seizing control of the political apparatus and engaging in politics has become so much the norm. There is an increasing effort amongst those on the fringe, those in the white nationalist crowd, to return to culture as being a dominant form of political organizing and recruitment. So you see the rise of, the kind of active club return. In many ways, it's a strategy that they borrowed from the neo-Nazi skinheads of the 1980s and 1990s. The idea that politics is downstream from culture, and that you have to first build a base of solidarity and support using culture as that vehicle to transport political ideologies that can then be put into practice in a variety of different ways. So while these groups often look alike, they may share very similar conspiracies and ideologies. They just may have different approaches to recruiting and different ways of engagement with society as a whole.
Yeah, this is definitely not my specialty area, so I'll say apparel. I think American universities, which totally forgetting what it stands for, but polarization and extremism
Yes,
and
sir.
some other things. They specifically sort of focus on this youth recruitment aspect. But I think what we see as well is some of this is happening in schools. And Southern Poverty Law Center labeled it anti-student inclusion movements. They often self-identify as parental rights movements. But they're attacks primarily on queer and trans kids, around immigrants, around like language and place of origin. And I think that, we're seeing a lot of fear around engaging with those groups. We talked about Brandon Durst, who's a superintendent of education. And I think that we're seeing sort of movement happening within school boards across the Pacific Northwest to bring in some of these sort of like ideologies of who is and who counts as being a part of the United States. And I just wanted to shout out that Western State Center has some incredible tools, particularly for educators, for parents, and for people who want to get involved in sort of the school realm, and engage in sort of what it looks like to have schools that are welcoming to everyone. And we've also seen Oregon, particularly Southern Oregon, there was two students who were queer and trans who identified their teachers as participating in an extremist anti-LGBTQ group and fought back against them. So I think while we are thinking about youth recruitment, I think we also have to just remember our youth who are struggling against their experiences being targeted in schools. Because while like Portland and Seattle often dictate policy, that doesn't always seep over into the east or south parts of the state. And a lot of times they have particularly carve outs for Eastern around that they're not going to enforce it. And a lot of these policies don't have enforcement that lead to a lot of our youth getting targeted in schools and without finding a lot of redress or support within their structures or systems. So if you're an educator listening and are interested, please check out the Western States Center's toolkits, because I think our schools are one of the places that people are also getting both pushed into far-right movements, and then people are experiencing the ramifications of being targeted by far-right folks.
All right. So we have time for one more question from the audience before we wrap it up. So there have been a few questions pop up in our Q&A section asking about what does the future look like, especially with the incoming administration, and what is the trajectory of some of these groups or movements look like? And with that in mind, what do sort of efforts to counter these influences, these far right influences look like at like state and local levels, and for law enforcement or at the national level? So what are the incoming sort of trajectories that we see, and how do we sort of counter that at different levels?
I'll just say that this is probably not a question for me. It's a question that I would call these other two panelists to ask. So I'm curious what they have to say.
Do you want to take it first or should I?
Go for it, Courtney.
Okay, I'll do my best. One of the things that I think about when I think about the future, I have, and I know a lot of other organizations, a lot of researchers have anxiety about the ways that the courts have been weaponized against researchers. And I'm thinking in Oregon and Washington of anti-doxing laws. There is currently a pending case where someone infiltrated a Patriot Front and outed some of their members as participating in nationalist movement work. And it's only pending because they've been unable to serve the person who did the infiltrating. And so that is a pending lawsuit happening. And I also think about how the Media Matters versus X lawsuit and the way that some well-funded folks who are involved in far-right extremist movement organizing have been able to weaponize their resources to sort of stamp out information and education. And I think that knowing our history is one of the best ways to get people involved, because when people often, in my experience, when you tell people about sort of the history of these movements, their attacks on individuals, people are outraged, but you just need to get that information in front of people in a way that's easy to digest and take action on. Um, and I also know that there are some land-based projects that have already sort of caught the attention of some right-wing folks, and I'm thinking particularly of the Ridge Wind Project in Idaho. So I've definitely sort of like got my eye on that and other future sort of clashes with the federal government. Um, yeah, and I if there's any funders on the call, just want to also shout out to remember to create line items for research work because it's going to become more difficult as researchers are facing a new set of laws that could potentially target us and target our organizations.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and I am loath to, give too much of a prediction. I think if past is prologue, during the last Trump administration, we saw a lot of increasing in street level activity, emboldened by the successes of a kind of broader nationalist vision. You saw the rise of groups like the Proud Boys and others being willing to engage in street confrontations against folks. And given at the end of the Trump administration, the targeting of the specific administration's targeting of anti-fascists as a terrorist organization. They attempt to try to demonize those folks in local communities standing up against this kind of stuff could be more problematic. We have a new piece up on our website. It's entitled "The Time for Mainstreaming." It looks at what the far right is currently thinking about regarding the kind of heading into the new administration and what they're anticipating. I'd encourage you all to read that. I think it's also important to remember that while this is all going on and while so much of the movement has been kind of directly connected to local engagement and kind of the latest amongst politics, there is that growing number of folks who are engaged in the kind of different level of organizing, that kind of deeper cultural organizing, which lasts beyond this kind of stuff, which means that this problem is going to exist for a longer time, particularly as they find a new generation of activists being mobilized by this stuff. And I would also say that it's important to remember that this stuff is constantly changing and evolving given current contexts. I would say the one thing to pay close attention to heading into a new administration is the focus on kind of anti-immigrant vitriol, whether that be things like a current bill in the state of Missouri, which provides for local citizens to become bounty hunters, to have $1,000 bounty for each undocumented immigrant. They help round up to calls for vigilantes to engage in the hunting on their own of undocumented immigrants. I think it means that there are going to be potential hotspots, not just on the southern border, but around the country where individuals think that they can take a lead from the current political climate and engage in the harassment and the and inflicting pain upon immigrant communities here in the country. So that's the thing, in the near term we're paying attention to, but then for the long term, looking both at where the kind of movements on the ground are headed, but also then the kind of ideological forebearers, who are driving this movement forward, be that folks like the national conservatives or other kind of white nationalist tendencies, where they're finding inspiration and ideas, connecting it to that larger push internationally for far right movements, as well as looking to recreate those kind of things here at home. So all of those things I think are worthy of paying attention to, and I think we've got a bumpy road ahead of us if the past tells us anything.
Yeah.
Just because I've said nothing, I do have one thing to say. On this is not a prediction. This is just a fact. Is that as the token reporter in the room, I have to say that specifically in Oregon, we have fewer reporters than we've ever had. We have several counties with no news outlet or one reporter for a 5,000 square mile region. So like back in the day, you know, when the Aryan Nations was around and reporters like David Newert and Bill Moreland, they were doing this unbelievable on the ground work on Ruby Ridge and things like that. Those people don't exist anymore. So we are in a really vulnerable position in the Northwest that any extremism coverage is typically done by reporters from the Beltway, from New York, who helicopter in and they write about our communities, and they oftentimes get it very, very wrong because they miss a lot of these cultural issues that we've been talking about. So, you know, if I'm panicked about anything, it's that. It's harder for me as a reporter that's been writing almost exclusively about extremism for a decade. You know, I can't get stories sold. So I think that this is a big problem. It's something that is beyond just the media is not going to figure it out. We still haven't figured out how to you know, deal with the loss of classified ads because of Craigslist. So I think that, you know, that should just light a fire under everybody maybe that's attending this to think about the ways that journalism is being done in the Northwest, how journalism is being supported, especially independent reporters like myself. But also, you know, we're seeing a lot of lawsuits against journalists. There's a chilling effect that's happening. So for a reporter like myself that doesn't have legal representation, you know, that's going to probably, you know, get me off a lot of stories if I know I might get sued for it. So what are ways that people can do to support independent reporting and local reporting in the Northwest?
Yeah. Well, you all raise, excellent points, and I know that none of us have a crystal ball, as, Devin said, so it's kind of hard to put any, feet to the pavement when it comes to making predictions like that. But with that said, in the interest of time, we'll conclude our Q&A session there, and therefore we will conclude our event. So first, I would like to thank our panelists, Devin, Leah, and Courtney, for taking time out of their day, taking time out of their work, to come and speak with myself and everybody else who attended today. We deeply appreciate you guys donating your time and your energy to coming and discussing this important issue. Second, this event is recorded, so we will put this up on our YouTube channel. So if you had to leave early or happen to miss it, be on the lookout on our YouTube channel at the Program on Extremism. And for my panelists, if there's anything, any projects or organizations that you're a part of that you'd like to promote or plug, please take your time and do so.
You can just find me. You can find the Institute at our website, irehr.org, or follow us on any of those social platforms. We try to keep folks up to date there, including a lot of our most recent reports and other activities. So please, yeah, we look forward to, continuing this conversation on those channels and making sure that folks are equipped with the knowledge they need to face the changes that we're going to see up here in the future.
I just also wanted to shout out that Western State Center is doing also beyond the toolkits, also does cohorts. There's one for civil leaders coming up. So if you're involved in any type of elected role, I encourage you to keep an eye out. The application is not out yet, but will be forthcoming. And also just personally, I'm an independent researcher and work on a contract basis. So like Leah, would just appreciate people taking time to think about who's doing this work and the protections that they need to do it safely without risk of losing your home.
I would be remiss if I, as an independent reporter, I didn't plug the projects that I have coming. So I have a new book coming out in March. It's called Blazing Eye Sees All. It's about the kind of, as we talk about the political spectrum, that if you get far enough left or far enough right, that those perspectives tend to meet. I think we're seeing that in folks like RFK and some of the energy around his Make America Healthy Again efforts. So this book is about new age ideologies, that kind of yoga to extremism pipeline. This comes out in March. And I have another book that is already out. It's called When the Moon Turns to Blood. It's about the case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. It's about religious extremism, Mormon extremism in Idaho. And that is out now. And then I also have a Substack. It's just my first and last name at substack.com, where I talk a lot about extremism and reporting on extremism in the West.
And also go listen to both seasons of Bundyville. That's excellent.
or that too.
All right. So with that being said, again, thank you for attending today to our panelists and to all of our attendees. And with that, we will be concluding this event. Thank